Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the start of our new Nautical Nights Winter 2022 speaker series. I'm very excited about our lineup of speakers this year, and I hope you are as well. A little bit of housekeeping before we get too far ahead. First of all, those of you who haven't joined us via YouTube before for our Nautical Night speaker series, or any program for that matter, your questions and comments can be submitted using the YouTube chat function. If that's not an option for you, you're very welcome to send us an email to marmus@marmuseum.ca. I'll put that email address in the chat. So at the end of the presentation, if you have any questions for David, then you're more than welcome to send them by email. I'll be checking them regularly. Without further, first of all, I'd love to welcome everyone to the screen this evening. It's not how we wanted to proceed this year, but it's the reality of the situation, and we're staying positive. So for those of you who haven't joined this speaker series, we're now at its 5th year, and it's in partnership with Kingston Yacht Club, where we would normally hold it in person. And the last several years, it's been conversations with a number of different local historians, storytellers, explorers from all over the country, actually starting to now, and to talk about any number of different topics that involve some kind of a nautical theme, maritime theme in some way. And so I see there's a slight issue with the audio. It should go away, but I'll keep an eye on it. There we go. So we're very excited to be able to continue to offer this series to the public, and certainly over virtual allows us to connect to a lot more people, and we're very excited about that. If you have a moment, I'd love to know where you're joining from. Please feel free to share that in the chat. The presentation this evening is by David Moore, and David is a regular speaker, perhaps, for our Nautical Night speaker series. I unfortunately wasn't here when he offered his presentations a couple of years ago about barley days, I think was one of them. But I'm very excited to be able to finally listen to yet another one of his presentations. Before we get started, though, on the introduction, I just want to say as well that the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes acknowledges the land and water we interact with to be the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat peoples of the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy. And we say water as well in that acknowledgement, because we are much a part of the land as the water, and it's the water and water routes are the traditional trade routes of the Indigenous peoples. In introducing our speaker this evening, David Moore, David was educated at the University of Waterloo with a BA in history, and recently completed his PhD at Queen's University in history. So congratulations, David. A graduate of the Humber School for Writers, he is an award-winning historical novelist with 4 books published to date in the Smithyman saga and commissioned family history. David is a sought-after lecturer on regional history, which he teaches regularly at the Kingston Senior Center. He has always loved tinkering and fooling around with boats of all sizes and types, but he is between boats at present. Post-retirement from a career in medical laboratories, David worked for several years as a volunteer and managing director for Brigantine Inc., a charity that owns and operates the Brigantine St. Lawrence II. If anyone was there for our autumn series, our autumn speaker night, you'll recognize that topic. He is proud to have accumulated several weeks serving aboard Kingston Square rigger as deckhand, ship's cook, and occasionally helmsman. He remains enthralled by Kingston's rich history, especially its maritime aspects, and for that we are very grateful, because yet again he's able to join us for another presentation, this time on Kingston's Royal Naval Dockyard. For who doesn't quite recognize that one, is located at what is now the Royal Military College, or Point Frederick, in Kingston, Ontario. So without further ado, I would love to welcome David Moore to the screen. Everyone join me in welcoming David. David, I invite you to unmute.
Unmuted, yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, David.
Great. Can everyone else?
Right. There's a couple of people having issues. I'm just trying to sort them out now. I would invite you to try refreshing your page, double check your computer audio. Hearing good so far in most places. I'll allow you to continue, David, and then anyone who's having any issues as well, I'll try to help you offline. Go ahead.
Shall I share my screen then?
Go right ahead.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm very, very happy to be back at the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes and Kingston Yacht Club Nautical Nights. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm particularly entertained this evening because this is my first presentation after achieving my doctorate at Queen's University. Thank you very much. So I hope you enjoy it tonight. As Michelle said, Kingston is located on traditional Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe territory. And for me, it is important to acknowledge this fact, particularly because these nations are an integral part of the continuous and important maritime history of what is now Kingston. This was one of many places where ingenious and sophisticated indigenous bark canoes were constructed for centuries before Europeans arrived. And this is attested to by extensive and repeated summer fishing communities on Wolf Island and elsewhere where they did not swim to. So we'll talk tonight a bit about the various harbors and dockyards of Kingston as a background. We'll talk about the Provincial Marine Dockyard on Point Frederick until 1812, which I will explain. And then the Royal Navy Dockyard, which happened during the War of 1812 from 1813 to 1815. And this is a bit of a truncated talk. There is a lot more history, as I hope you will understand by the time I get to the end of it. So Kingston's maritime history is very deep, broad, and continuous, and I would challenge folks to say that it's one of the most interesting histories, maritime histories in the world. There have been many European-style shipyards here since 1673, when Sieur de La Salle was the first to construct small vessels at Fort Frontenac, which were the first European sailing vessels on the Great Lakes. And we have no pictures of those, go figure, but this is one of the semi-mythical Frontenac of 10 tons that was built, one of the ships built at Kingston during that time. I'll just do a very brief review of how deep our maritime history is in this town. At the top there, you can see Davis, Metalcraft, and Fort Frontenac. Those are inner harbor, what we consider inner harbor, and thanks to Brian Osborne for inspiring this division. And then if you go to the right, there's the Provincial Marine and Royal Dockyard at RMC here, which I'll be talking about tonight. Then just to the southwest from Fort Frontenac is where the Marine Museum is now. And that was part of the extension of the harborfront shipbuilding and wharf and warehousing that occurred in Kingston during the 19th century. Just south of that in this chart of Kingston Harbor, thank you, Canada maps, was Garden Island, and D.D. Calvin there built a huge business, not only with ships, wooden ships, some of which sailed around the world essentially, but also with these huge timber rafts that he sent down to Quebec City. To the west there is Portsmouth Harbor. That's basically where I live. It was originally called Hatteras Bay, and in the 19th century, there were dozens of 100+ foot wooden schooners that were built and sailed out of Hatteras Bay. And then to the farther west, there's Collins Bay, which also produced its own lumber rafts and ships during the 19th century. To talk about the Provincial Marine and the Royal Naval Dockyard, the early part of the history of the dockyard, the Great Lakes Naval Forces from the 7 Years' War were always a department of the British Army, not the Navy. And they were known as the Provincial Marine. And there was a reason for this, which kept them firmly under the control of the provincial governors, not the imperial authorities of the Admiralty in London. And the British Provincial Marine had somewhat inauspicious beginnings in the 7 Years' War, 1755 or 6, when the first British naval forces on the Great Lakes were built at Oswego across the river during the 7 Years' War. And this squadron not only lost the only Lake Ontario French-British naval encounter in the summer of 1756, but they were all captured by French General Montcalm when Oswego fell that August. And then they had the unfortunate fate of being burned by Colonel Bradstreet in 1758 when he in turn captured Fort Frontenac. General Amherst in 1760 built a couple of new vessels in Oswego, but following the surrender of New France with respect to Kingston, or what is now Kingston, there was really almost nothing going on here until 1783, other than some transient itinerant fur trapping and some tree felling that was associated with the British Provincial Marine Port at Carleton Island. But the end of the American Revolution in 1783 then brought Loyalist refugees by the thousands from the former 13 colonies to settle here. Wharves and warehouses were first established near Fort Frontenac ruins on the inner harbor in 1783 by Major John Ross of Sir John Johnson's King's Royal Regiment of New York, and Johnson Street in Kingston is named after Sir John. And these, through the 19th century, gradually spread west along the outer harbor shoreline as the population, as transshipping and ship construction activities increased. But after the American Revolution, commercial boat and shipbuilding really only began officially until after Governor Sir Guy Carleton, Lord Dorchester, lifted the wartime ban on private shipping in 1787. And this is a picture by a fairly well-known surveyor and artist, James Peachey of 1784, looking at the inner harbor of Kingston from the point of view of where Joseph and Molly Brant's houses were at the time. And you can see there are wharves developing along the inner harbor then, and the ships debarking and working. And these were Provincial Marine ships at the time, one there and one there, during this very early period of colonial British settlement. It took about another 4 or 5 years until the Provincial Marine decided to move to Kingston. It had a much better harbor, it considered, at Carleton Island. But then Carleton Island fell to the south of the new international border with the United States. And the Provincial Marine Commodore Rene Hippolyte Laforce began construction of the first naval wharves on Point Frederick, where RMC is now, in 1789. Rather ironically, Laforce had also been the Commodore of the French naval squadron constructed at Fort Frontenac during the 7 Years' War that had defeated the English squadron from Oswego. But he had loyally served the British during the American Revolution beginning in 1775 and for many, many years after. Laforce organized several buildings to be transported to the new site on Point Frederick, where RMC is, from the Revolutionary War major wartime Provincial Marine Shipyard on Carlton Island. And Laforce had also supervised that site. The foundation of what is likely one of these is the oldest structure discovered to date on the current site at RMC. Thank you, Susan Baisley, for her archaeological research on this site. But there is the foundations of a building that was likely put there by René Hippolyte Laforce. For several years, this Point Frederick yard was pretty small and used mostly to repair and maintain existing provincial marine vessels, such as this 80-ton schooner named Onondaga. And Laforce had built that too in the 1791 or 92 for the Provincial Marine, but the facilities at Point Frederick were not sufficient to build it there at the time. And this was described, as the drawing says, by the wife of the first Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. So by the time the War of 1812 actually began, the Provincial Marine Dockyard in Kingston had already shown itself capable of constructing a pretty wide variety of vessels, ranging from gunboats 70 feet or so, and schooners a bit larger, to the 1809 ship-rigged Royal George, which was the largest and most powerful warship on Lake Ontario when the war began. Now, I have to say, for those who think this is a history of battles and important generals and admirals and so on, big people, big men, as it were, important men, much of the important history I'm going to talk about right now is that of the folks who actually built the vessels. These were scarce, very highly skilled, contract hired civilians who interacted with British imperial military authorities under the intense pressure of war. And that's perhaps the most interesting thing about this history from the point of view of a modern historian. The significance of the 1812 to 14 naval and logistics supply war on the Great Lakes, and the war itself, to be clear, has often been downplayed, mostly by Americans. But for the British and Upper Canadians, it was critically important if they wished the colony to actually remain part of the British Empire. And by extension, from Upper Canadians, Ontario is now part of Canada, and it may not have been if this war had been lost. One of the advantages that the United States had was that American forces could be, and they had to work at it, but they could be resupplied from the south overland and up rivers without interference from the enemy, which was the British and the Upper Canadians at the time. But in Canada, in Upper and Lower Canada, there were no useful roads for military purposes between Montreal and Kingston and Niagara. So you can think about that. That was, 500 or 600 kilometers between the supply source at Montreal, and things had to get there from 5,000 kilometers overseas in Ireland and England. and then be transported up the St. Lawrence River by bateaus to Kingston, and then transshipped by sailing vessels to the west end of the lake to support the army. If the Americans were able to establish control of Lake Ontario, it would mean that nothing west of Kingston could be supplied with anything, including food. So the dockyards were strategic assets. Each side squadrons were small enough on the lakes that the launch or the lack of one vessel could tip the balance in favor of one combatant and affect the entire course of the war. Populations were very small. Civilian population in Kingston in 1911 was about 1,500 maximum, with about 150 buildings that they were housed in. The military garrison totaled about 100 men. But neither the pre-war dockyard on Point Frederick nor Point Henry were fortified in any way at the outbreak of war. June 18th, 1812, the Americans declared war. And at that time, the Provincial Marine Dockyard installations on Point Frederick had a couple of wooden storehouses, a work shed, a mold and plan loft, and a hospital. There was a saw pit, a slipway, and stocks where the ships were built on the eastern shore of Point Frederick on Navy Bay. There were some accommodations. This was, after all, a department of the Army that existed for the Deputy Assistant Commissary General and the Army storekeeper and some officers. And a small guardhouse, perfunctory guardhouse, was staffed, as the rest of Kingston was, by the 10th Royal Veterans Battalion, all of whom were rather elderly. There were very few dockyard officers in the Kingston dockyard before the war, and the exact number is unknown, partly because the quartermaster's department of the Army that ran the Provincial Marine was a little slack in keeping statistics with regard to the naval forces. We do know that Master Builder John Dennis and Foreman of Artificers Donald McKay were supervisors of them. And three of the larger ships in Kingston each had one naval carpenter aboard: the Royal George, the Earl of Moira, and the Duke of Kent. And they had all been built in Kingston by the Provincial Marine. The 20-gun ship Royal George was commanded in 1812 by a 74-year-old man, older even than me, Captain John Steele. And it was crewed by 28 officers and men. This was a full three-masted, ship-rigged sloop of war with 20 guns. And each gun normally required, they were carronades, normally required a crew of 5. So just to crew the guns would have required 100 men, never mind sail the ship. And Captain Steele had 28 men. The 10-gun Earl of Moira, which was also, built in Kingston, was commanded by a man named Hugh Earl, Lieutenant Hugh Earl, and Earl Street in Kingston is named after him. And she had 18 officers and men for a ship that required 50 just to man the guns. There was a schooner, Duke of Gloucester, which had a commander and a crew, but she was rotten and could not be used for battle, although she was sailable. And then there was the Duke of Kent, an older vessel, which was just a stationary hulk used by the Provincial Marine as barracks for Army and Navy and Provincial Marine crews. The dockyard, as I said, included maybe a dozen people, including artificers and supervisors. So for the first year of the war, 1812, the Provincial Marine sailing officers and crews on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie consisted of a totally inadequate number of untrained merchant vessel sailors, and they were mostly hired on one-year renewable contracts from the Merchant Marine. By December 1812, so 6 months into the war, many of those decided not to renew their contracts. And by then it became clear to all, including Governor Prevost, that his existing forces on the lake were not going to be sufficient for what would prove to be a life and death struggle for supremacy on the lake against the United States Navy. And here is one of the reasons that Prevost made this decision. On the left, you see, this is a lovely painting by Peter Rindlisbacher, a Canadian maritime painter who's very famous. On the left, you see the Royal George, a three-masted ship-rigged sloop of war, anchored in Kingston Harbor, defending herself against the American fleet flotilla under Commodore Chauncey from Sackett's Harbor. On the extreme left, you see Oneida, USS Oneida, and a couple of schooners. But there were 5 more schooners that had pursued the Royal George into the harbor. And I have to credit Hugh Earle, her captain, for making the proper decision not to fight it out on Lake Ontario, because he would quickly be overwhelmed and boarded by hundreds of men on these 6-7 ships that outnumbered him. So he ran into harbor and escaped capture with minor damage. But to a public in Upper Canada and, I dare say Britain, that was accustomed to the great feats of Lord Nelson and other, great accomplishments of the Royal Navy, this was pretty miserable. And they complained vociferously. And late in 1812, Governor Prevost wrote to the Admiralty in London and asked the Royal Navy to come and take over the situation, the terrible situation on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. But the coming of war was not just a problem for the sailors in the Provincial Marine. Capital T trouble was also a brewing among the artificers and workers in the Kingston Dockyard itself. The Provincial Marine master builder was John Dennis. He was a loyalist American who had come early to Upper Canada, had been working on the lake since 1796, and since 1803, he had been in charge of the Kingston Dockyard, and including he supervised the construction of the Royal George, which the Navy, when it finally arrived, said was by all accounts very well built and survived through the entire war. Over the first winter of the war then, from 1812 to 1813, the Kingston Dockyard and the Provincial Marine had been directed to build a new warship even more powerful than the Royal George. She was eventually named the Wolf and launched in the spring of 1813. The Navy people acclaimed her as fine a vessel of her class as ever sailed under the British pennant. A fine endorsement of the construction quality of the Provincial Marine Dockyard. But before that, in the late winter of 1812-13, disagreements between very senior leadership. Prevost and Brock disagreed. General Brock disagreed on whether the main Lake Ontario port and harbor and dockyard should be at York, now Toronto, or Kingston. And this began to extend downward and became apparent among the dockyard master builders. Master builder Dennis, that we've talked about, was sent off to York in the winter to work on a new ship there in early 1813. But Prevost decided that he would send another as well. And these two men could not agree even on the location of the dockyard on the shoreline at what is now Toronto. So work went slowly. And by the time the navigation season and the ice went out in 1813, work on this ship was not complete. Acting Dockyard Commissioner Andrew Gray, who had sent Dennis to York, replaced him with a fellow named Morrison in February in the winter of 1813, and then promptly fired him because he was an incompetent leader. Oh, but he had to keep him on building spars in the dockyard because he was so skilled, and well, you know, good help was hard to find. So Gray then, after firing Morrison, promoted an American-born fellow, William Allen, who was a shipwright, to succeed Morrison. And then he left. He had to go to York to solve the issues between the master builders in York. And the guy he left here was, suspicious of Americans. And he detected a, quote, mutinous spirit in the yard, but he was, in spite of employing spies in the yard, he could not pinpoint a source. There were chronic shortages at this time, of course, of these skilled shipwrights. These were not military people, they were all civilians. And they split them, the British command split them between Kingston and York, and it meant the dockyard in Kingston was working flat out. And the skilled artificers were then becoming aware of their own importance to the war effort because of the pressure put on them to produce. So in the meantime, 120 carpenters were hired in Quebec and sent up at the end of 1812. Oh, but their records were lost en route. And they ended up not being paid for months. And, in a management crisis, what do? You add more managers. I've been a veteran of the hospital public service, and, that's what you do to make things more efficient. And Gray did that. I'm not sure what impression it had on the skilled folks in the Provincial Marine, but one can imagine that it might not have been possible. And on March 10th, in the late winter of 1813, the dockyard workers went on strike. Well, this wasn't unheard of by civilian workers. It wasn't even unheard of by sailors or army personnel, although they tended to call it mutiny with military people. But the local guy said they nearly to a man refused to work, giving some frivolous reasons about provisions not having been sent to them that were completely contradicted by the quartermaster, of course. So when the men on the dockyard refused to work, Gray's replacement, whose name was Captain Irwin, he called in the army and surrounded these workers at bayonet point. And all but one then, surprisingly, very surprisingly went back to their posts. There was one who held out, who it is said was detained, but we don't know how long. Probably not long. And subsequent investigation by very senior leadership in the Army revealed that there was indeed a real issue with lack of provisions. And a general order was issued by Governor Prevost in June, a few months later, which ended pay stoppages for provisions for the Kingston artificers, which meant they didn't have to pay for their food anymore. And this was backdated to February, a month before the strike. Now, you can probably imagine in the middle of the War of 1812, how reluctant the British leadership was to backdate their pay to several months before, but they did. So 3 weeks after the strike, Captain Irwin fired Allen and promoted George Record to replace him. And Record was the 4th Kingston master builder then in the dockyard in a few months, implying some significant disorganization. Things did settle down for a time, and the ship that they were working on over the winter of 1812-13 was called the Sir George Prevost in an attempt to curry favor, I'm sure, which Prevost rejected and said, rename it Wolf. And the Wolf was successfully launched in April of 1813, just as the ice went out. And the Wolf evened up the playing field with the Americans then. They had launched their own new powerful ship at Sackett Harbor across the lake the previous November, and had established a naval superiority enough to enable a successful attack by the Americans on York at the end of April 1813, just after the ice went out and before the ice went out in Kingston. This is a later picture, but on the left you see the ship they had launched at Sackett Harbor for the Americans, and on the right, the Wolf that was launched at Kingston in the spring of 1813. So the balance was maintained in essence, but the victory at York meant that General Scaife, who was in charge in the West, had to retreat to Kingston. And when he retreated, he burned the ship that they had spent so much time and energy on building at York, and abandoned a whole bunch of naval stores intended for Lake Erie, and left the town which was sacked by the Americans. And the retaliation echoed over to Britain, and the burning of the White House was intended to retaliate for the sacking of York in early 1813. But more particular to our topic here, some of the civilian ship carpenters and the merchant marine sailors who had signed up to the Provincial Marine were captured during the battle and taken off to the United States for a time. So and I say likely disgruntled, remainder, I can only imagine, had to march to Kingston from Toronto on foot. It did strengthen the dockyard workforce here, but the defeat at York, the visible leadership conflicts going down to the leadership of the dockyard itself, and exposure to combat probably didn't do anything to endear the civilian dockyard workers to the British cause. But in the spring, Prevost's prayers were answered, and Commodore Sir James Lucas Yeo arrived with 500 officers and seamen from the Royal Navy. The first ones to arrive were Captain Robert Barclay and several officers who had been sent up from Bermuda. And they had arrived at New Brunswick and then marched overland in March and April using sleighs and snowshoes. Quite an epic journey that has been overshadowed by history. And he stopped in Quebec and Montreal on his way, of course. And he was instructed by Prévost to take over the Provincial Marine, many of whose ship's officers then left the service or were forced to take lesser positions ashore. And Barclay, when he arrived in Kingston, also assumed command of the Provincial Marine Dockyard. And this established it for the first time as a Royal Naval facility. And henceforth, its ships' names would be prefaced by HMS, His Majesty's Ship. A couple of weeks later, Yeo arrived in Kingston in May, and he then sent Barclay west to take command of the ill-fated Lake Erie Provincial Marine Flotilla and Dockyard that was at Amherstburg, just where the Detroit River enters Lake Erie. And later that summer, partly because of the lost stores at York that Chauncey had captured in the spring, Barclay lost a near-run fleet battle with the Americans. And this fleet battle loss resulted in the British Army retreating hastily east, away from the Detroit River on half rations, and were defeated at the Battle of Moraviantown and the death of Tecumseh himself. And thus the western half of Upper Canada was lost because it could no longer be supplied from Lake Erie. Not Barclay's fault, as it turns out, but we can't talk about that now. Yeo, meanwhile, appointed Naval Dockyard Commissioner for Upper Canada, Richard O'Connor, who took charge in July 1813 before the defeat on Lake Erie, and he immediately set the Kingston Yard to work on two new heavy frigates, Princess Charlotte and Prince Regent. And these were indeed heavy frigates. Up until that time on the ocean, a 44-gun frigate was as big as there was, and the Americans had them. And Princess Charlotte and Prince Regent were stronger than that. But in the end, O'Connor was hauled away to Amherstburg again by Yeo before Amherstburg was lost. And he named a replacement, Thomas McCulloch, which was an unfortunate appointment, as the saying goes. In mid-1813, there were 152 skilled artificers, civilians, working in the dockyard in Kingston, about 10 times the number of 1812. But within a few weeks, McCulloch had succeeded in antagonizing most of them. And on 27th of September, 1813, the Kingston shipyard workers struck once more. None had been paid for 2 months, and without cash or army bills, they could not get credit with the Kingston merchants, and therefore could not pay for fresh food or anything else that they wanted in the town. And there had been no ration and promised in their contracts of dried peas, apparently for many months. It was a topic of grievance in the March strike as well. And then, of course, as one work gang's gig expired when the ship was launched, they were asked to re-sign and stay on, but they learned that the new hires were being paid more. and they refused to accept rehiring until they fixed that minor issue. And then, with all the temerity of the world, they asked for an increase in their rum ration as well. And General Derrick was quite considerate. He authorized an immediate pay advance of a month's pay, and managed to convince them that the reason they hadn't had peas since November was because none had come up from Montreal. And there were none to be had. And as soon as there were peas to be had, they would get some. He also promised to look into an increase in the rum ration. Eventually it was granted. And also the increase in pay demanded by some of the workers. But he said that group would have to return to work immediately and prove that they were worthy of such an increase, which they all did. Derrick wrote about this to Prevost and to O'Connor. And within a couple of weeks, O'Connor had come back to the yard from Lake Erie. When he got back, he was not only concerned about fixing the issues with the strike, but he was concerned by the rate of progress on the new ships, because his subordinate McCullough had directed the men to work on many other less important projects, including some gunboats, some new army barracks, and constructing whatever was a flying bridge across the Cataraqui River, rather than concentrating on the 2 ships of war that they needed to maintain control of Lake Ontario. So O'Connor wrote to Montreal, to Prevost, and to his military secretary and said, take some of the load off, please. Get some of the Lower Canada carpenters to make these oars, 2,000 oars. You can imagine the load of workload on the Kingston Dockyard to make these oars, 2,000 oars. And that eased the burden on Kingston somewhat. And then he wrote to the governor, the general in command, that all was well on October 14th. Dealings with the artificers were being conducted with good understanding and perfect cordiality, and a due regard paid to the prompt settlements of their accounts, and likewise to their comforts. But comforts were not really on the list in reality. Kingston was not the relatively cozy city of Plymouth or Chatham or even Halifax or even Quebec City, where workers were able to live a normal life and go home after their working shifts. Kingston was not only the frontier, but it was also the front line of the war. And a post-war survey by the naval storekeeper noted 34 shanties that they lived in, ranging from, a small bedroom to a somewhat larger establishment, 18 by 27 feet. And he reported that there has been, very proudly, that there has been no further expense to the government than a small quantity of nails and glass. These places were the most miserable dwellings that can be imagined. Wood is occasionally given to the men to stop the leaks and drifting snow from coming through the roofs and sides. And this was the workforce they depended on to defeat the Americans. And of course, despite such wonderful comforts, the shipwrights were beginning to show an inclination not to re-sign their contracts. And then when they were denied their wishes to visit families in Lower Canada over the winter, a few began to desert. Most of those returned when they discovered that at the time in the late fall of 1813, the American army occupied both sides of the river between Kingston and Montreal. And when they were told there would be no punishments if they came back and went back to work. Yeo, The Commodore was, of course, concerned, and he wrote Prevost in October, with a bit of a slap at O'Connor, whom he had appointed, who had been making enormous efforts to retain these folks. Until some effort is made to retain those we have and obtain a number of others, the present force for building his naval force is very inadequate. He did officially sympathize with the plight of these unpaid for many months civilian builders. There were shortages of fresh meat and vegetables, and they could not buy, quote, anything that was nourishing in a country that is subject to the lake fever and dysentery. The labor shortage did begin to improve late in 1813. Some artificers, after the defeat of Barclay on Lake Erie, retreated from the abandoned base at Amherstburg, and another 80 were sent up in December of 1813 from Lower Canada as well. And so by January 1814, in the middle of winter in Kingston, there were probably 300 skilled workers working in the yard, plus about another 500 sailors that Yeo would put to work during the winter to help them as laborers. And Prince Regent and Princess Charlotte were duly launched in April 1814. And I won't discuss that a month later, Yeo took them off to capture Oswego or bombard and subdue Oswego as a port successfully. He never mentioned the success of this dockyard in getting these ships done over the winter. But after Prince Regent and Princess Charlotte were launched, contracts began to expire again. And the new project, which was the line of battleship St. Lawrence of 102 guns, twice the size of anything else on the lake, began to slow once more because the artisans were beginning to refuse to sign new contracts. Luckily, more artificers arrived from Britain in July, and then they also granted permission to the men from Lower Canada to bring their families to Kingston. And it was at the time, wives and daughters could be paid to cook or do laundry and were exempt from paying for provisions as well. And the workforce stabilized over the summer. And HMS St. Lawrence, variously 102 or 110 guns, depending on which account you read at which time, was successfully launched in September of 1814. She was the largest sailing warship ever to be completed on the Great Lakes and immediately gained naval superiority over the United States. The US Navy never again left Sackett's Harbor while the war lasted, and the shipbuilding war was won. There's a picture painted by an anonymous artist in 1814 of the launch of HMS St. Lawrence. And it's hard to get a sense of the scale of this ship. And I suspect the artist has exaggerated a bit with the size of these individuals down there, but she was huge. She was as large, 2,000 plus tons and 200 plus feet overall as the largest steel ship ever built in Kingston. And by far larger than saltwater merchant ships of the time. This was a stupendous achievement for a little place like Kingston. There she is. Peter Rindlisbacher gave me permission, thank you, Peter, to show this lovely painting of HMS St. Lawrence leading the Kingston Squadron in late 1814. When she was launched, the Royal Dockyard was employing over 500 skilled workmen, carpenters, iron workers, and so on. and roughly half of them were French Canadian. There were another 500 at least who worked as laborers, mostly seconded from the Navy crews. And at war's end, the labor force in January of the Kingston Royal Dockyard had expanded from about 12 at the beginning of the war to 1,200. And that was approaching the pre-war population of the entire town of Kingston. So here on this Admiralty plan at the end of the war, you can see this scattering of little huts. These were the shanties of 500 artificers that lived on site. You can see here, this is the St. Lawrence, this is Navy Bay, over here is Kingston Harbor, and to the left is the city of Kingston. Here in this lovely painting, I don't know why they put so much sky in the world in these paintings, but Hugh Irvin painted this in 1815, and you can see these little bumps on the edge of the treeless peninsula. Those are the shanties where the workers lived during the war. You can see here, this is St. Lawrence, and this is one of the lesser ships, maybe Princess Charlotte or Prince Regent. And this is, so this is just immediately after the war, with the ships going into what's called ordinary, with their topmasts taken down and tents over their decks. It's another view. And at the time, you can see in the background behind the commandant's building, two huge ships building a building that were the equivalent of St. Lawrence that were never completed after the war. So here's a wonderful evocative painting by Mr. Rindlisbacher of December, Christmas Eve, 1814. They did not know at the time, but their Christmas present would be the end of the war, which was signed next week in Britain. They didn't learn of it until much later, months later, but before the new navigation season began. The end of the war marked the end of an era, and recent archaeology by Dr. Baisley has confirmed that there is nothing remaining above ground from that time. But there are other physical and human threads that can be directly traced to that time in the present day in Kingston. The Royal Dockyard did receive a new commissioner after war, a man named Captain Robert Barry, who built up the yard significantly. The present Royal Military College Commandant's residence and the stone frigate were built, which was built to shelter the rigging and spars of the fleet, are prominent examples of Barry's tenure. He continued in command from 1819 until 1834, when the dockyard was officially closed, and he went back to Britain and retired a rear admiral. The dockyard had to be reopened in 1837 when armed rebellion in Upper Canada and attacks by armed American militias occurred. And this time it stayed open until 1853. But these are other stories, and I imagine that the Marine Museum is looking at other people to tell them, perhaps. So here's a sort of a timeline. This is 1815. You can see St. Lawrence here and Prince Regent and some of the lesser vessels here, and the artificers' shanties here. 13 years later, it's still got St. Lawrence and still got those ships on the stocks, but they're beginning to deteriorate. And in the meantime, Barry has built the stone frigate here. 1833, the year before it's officially closed, there's just this hulk left here. St. Lawrence has been sold off, and the stone frigate is here. But so the bones of several of those warships now are in Deadman's Bay, which is just below Fort Henry to the left. And indeed, those of the mighty St. Lawrence herself can be seen if you take a boat or a dive, submerged just offshore at the Tet Center. Other links, though, are also present. A young shipwright from Sorel, Laura, Canada, named Amable Beaupre came to Kingston with his brother to work in the dockyard, and HMS St. Lawrence was partly his handiwork in 1814. And this is an excerpt from the payroll ledger of July or September 1814. And you probably can't read it, but down there it has the name of Beaupre for the brothers. They were paid 10 shillings a day, and then they made their mark. And he had an impact on Kingston that lasted to this day. Amable's skills were such that he was kept on by the Navy until 1820, and he eventually settled in Portsmouth, where he and his family established a wooden shipbuilding and shipping dynasty that lingers to this day in the form of the 1864 Portsmouth Tavern that his son Edward originally built as their home. It's still a favorite watering hole with recreational sailors, local residents, and students alike. And it is a living artifact connecting us directly back to the Royal Dockyard of 1812. Thank you so much for listening. This is just a tiny part, maybe you have gathered that, of Kingston's fascinating marine history. And I'm so happy that you are contributing to the winter life of Kingston Yacht Club and the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston. Any questions?
Thank you so much, David. It's so much information all in one little location, one little spit of land, and it had me realizing that last year at this time, that the first speaker of our series for 2021 was Jonathan Moore, talking about the these national historic sites, the shipwrecks, Prince Regent, Princess Charlotte, and St. Lawrence, along with a couple of other ones. But it was quite fitting that we were before and after. I did put in the chat that anyone who missed last year's presentation, which was I think the 13th of January, it is available on our website for you to watch. You can continue to listen on about what happened to these shipwrecks, the multiple sources about what actually happened to St. Lawrence after it was sold to Morton's Brewery. There's some speculation that it caught fire, and then there's some people saying that it kind of broken up during a storm, floated down off the moor, some that it just completely sank. So it's always quite interesting to read those historical accounts and try to piece them together. And that's kind of, well, that's your role as a historian, is to try to piece together and provide as much of the context as possible, so people can interpret their own solutions. Sorry, one second. So I have put a call out. If anyone has any questions they would like to submit using the YouTube chat, please do. You're also welcome to send them to our email address, marmus@marmuseum.ca, that has been provided in the chat. And I see there's a few comments that have rolled in here. Guillaume, of course, who's a diver, talking about what actually happened with St. Lawrence. So that's an interesting one. Andy's asking, you mentioned the name Yo in connection with the Navy in Kingston. Is it the same Yo after whom the building Yo Hall is named?
Well, that's a good question. Where is Yo Hall? But I suspect it must be the same one. He was an important guy in Kingston history, and became an admiral himself before he died. And so I wouldn't doubt that Yo Hall is named after him for sure.
Andy specified that it is RMC, so I would expect that
Oh,
absolutely
yeah,
named after our
absolutely. Oh, for
Yo-Yo.
sure. For sure. If it was on the West Coast, maybe a different guy, but at RMC, no.
Yes, absolutely. Is Howe Island named after Captain William Howe Mulcaster?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. There were several Howes involved in, colonial Canadian history, and there were two Howes at the beginning of the American Revolution, one a general and one an admiral in New York. I suspect that it was one of those, but I'm sorry, I don't know for sure.
All right. Next question that came in was some clarification of what lake fever is.
Oh, lake fever was, a generalized term for things like malaria or other low-grade fevers that happened. They blamed them all on the swamps, and Yo in particular at the time, and the early 1800s was referring to the swamps in the inner harbor that were sort of adjacent to the Navy dockyard. So yes, there were it could have been any number of things associated with swamp fever and that sort of thing, for sure.
All right, questions are rolling in here. I'm going to jump to Marion Rubin's comment about one that's wonderful presentation, and just kind of talking a little bit about the exact position of St. Lawrence. There has actually been, I distinctly remember at least once on Google, if you look on Google Earth or satellite, it came up actually the skeleton of it. You could just barely make it out, but it's tucked right into the tiny little bay. There's a bit of a breakwater and there's a little bay, and it's tucked right in there safely. I understand that the breakwater actually was built to protect the shipwreck, but again, varying accounts of that one. Next question was whether or not the stone frigate is still standing. Yes, it is. Dave, can you speak to perhaps what it's used for now?
Oh, I think it's a student residence now. RMC historians and current students and professors will likely correct me, but as I understand it, the stone frigate is now a student residence, and it has been for some time.
Just going to actually, if you stop your screen share, Dave, we'll have to be able to see you.
I'm not sure you want to do that, but there you go.
There we go. So let's see here. I lost it. Next question was, what happened to Andrew Gray?
Oh, he died. He was killed when Captain Gray was asked to go off to, I think it was the assault on Oswego. He was killed during that assault and didn't survive the war.
All right. Unfortunate ending to that story. Right. Okay. Lots of great feedback for you here, Dave. I'll make sure I pass this on.
Wonderful.
Yo Hall is the cadet dining hall at RMC. Someone has commented.
There you go. That's who it's named after.
And there's a Mulcaster Islands and 1,000 Islands. So all these little names popping up.
Yeah, wonderful. You can see how this is, real continuous history to us, linking right to us in the present day.
Absolutely. Continues on. So there was a comment about, I understand the confused preparation for a shipyard at York also confused the Americans into believing a major yard was being constructed, and this led to the attack on York. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, I think that's possibly quite true. One of the interesting things that was to occur throughout the war is that although the Americans understood that capturing Kingston was the key to the whole of Upper Canada. If they captured Kingston and held it, the rest of Upper Canada was theirs. They were always not quite superstitious, but they always believed the worst of the information they received about the forces in Kingston that were there to defend it. So they never did attack it. And York was kind of a sideshow in that sense. It was, they made an excuse to go off to York instead of to go to Kingston, because it would be, just as good. And they could isolate all of the British forces there. But, strategically, they were just wrong.
There you have it. Let's see here.
Thus pronounces Dr. Dave.
Right. British. There we go. So Reese Smith piped up with that he wrote a paper burying the stone frigate, so that the British expected another conflict with the US. So the stone frigate was built to contain war stores from Quebec and Montreal.
Yes, that's quite true. When Barry built the stone frigate, the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which I shamefully didn't mention, in 1817, 2 years after the war, meant that the lakes were to be de-weaponized, and weapons were limited. Naval weapons were limited, but both the Americans and the British kept some things in their hip pocket that they didn't want to give up in case this just didn't work. And the stone frigate and Barry's preparations in the 1820s and 30s were kind of part of that philosophy that said, yeah, we got peace now, but it isn't going to last forever. So we better be ready for the next one. And part of that philosophy was they realized they were not ready for the last one.
History, learning from history. There you have it.
Or not.
Or not. I won't comment on that part. So the last comment I'll pull up here is that this talk suggests that the Royal Canadian Navy's present problems with manning and ship construction are not new. There we go.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
It was more of a comment than a question, I realize now. But
well, that's fine. I'm happy to comment on it. For the great democracies, war has always been a problem when we're not at war. And in between wars, we tend to, on the one hand, say that, well, we'll never have another war, so we won't invest in anything to keep up to date. And on the other hand, say, we're going to fumble the ball. I don't think they say that consciously, but we're going to award contracts for various things that make no sense in many ways, that are political contracts. And that's a fault of every democracy. I don't think you can fault the Canadian government or the Canadian Navy. We muddle through. I've been aboard some of the now ancient, one of the now ancient anti-submarine frigates, the HMCS Toronto. And they're very impressive vessels. I think for a middle power, we probably don't do enough. The lefties, I'm pretty much of a lefty myself, but I know those to the off the left wingtip of my arm will be criticizing me. I think Canada doesn't do enough and doesn't do it logically or sensibly enough. But we're still there. We still have a very effective Navy. a very effective Army and a very effective Air Force, in spite of it all, working in a democracy.
All right. Thank you very much, Dave. It's bringing the presentation to the present. I love it. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them by email and I'll happily forward them on to Dave or Dr. Moore. And before you sign off here, I just wanted to put a little call out to let you know that the up next in our series is Bruce McDonald, who I think has joined us this evening, with his presentation Sisters of the Ice on the 26th of January. And Bruce will be talking a bit about our Canadian Arctic sovereignty and looking back at some of the ships and sailors who worked in the Arctic when it was still seen as a terra incognita, unclaimed by any country. This is a linked series of true Canadian Arctic sea stories, illustrated with many never before seen public photographs, as well as a short historical video. So if you haven't signed up for the series, I invite you to check out the next one, and of course the rest of the series. As I said at the beginning, I'm very excited about this series. Again, if any questions are remaining, please feel free to send them by email, and I will certainly pass those on. And lastly, I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us. Consider a museum membership. Lots of exciting things planned for 2022. And stay well, stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you on the 26th of January. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Michelle.
There we go. Oh,